So how many people, just out of interest, were there last night at the talk? Oh, cool, a few of you. Excellent, okay, great. So the first part of the talk you might find is a recap from last night's talk, which is the how animals learn part, because I think it's important to cover that aspect. And then what we're going to do tonight is almost less of the PowerPoint and sort of almost more of a discussion. So we can talk about reducing stress, and we're going to talk about reducing stress with cats and dogs, and hopefully some rabbits or birds or any animal that you'd like to talk about, fish. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. I started working professionally in training and behaviour about 10 years ago. I started not knowing really what I was doing. I was always interested in animals, and from around 13 years of age I spent a lot of time in vet practices, doing voluntary work and work experience during the weekends. And I came across a German Shepherd who I got when he was 7 months old, and we're walking him down the street, and as we were walking he grabbed hold of the guy's arm and started shaking it, and so I managed to get him off that first guy, and then a couple of days later it happened again, and so then decided I had to take him training classes, and also realised that he'd bark and lunge and scream at other dogs as we're walking down the street. So working with him got me really interested in training, so I started off working with him at the ex-police training school, where we used the choke chain, kneeing him for jumping up. We thought about a prong collar, but we didn't actually go there. Used spray collars, citronella collars, stepping on his back feet for jumping up to try and reduce jumping up that way. If he barked and lunged at other dogs, then potentially sort of cutting off his air supply. And so there are some things that we did just because they seemed wrong, but almost the police officer, who obviously handled lots of German Shepherds, knew what he was talking about, told us that we had to do this. If we didn't, then he was going to get worse and potentially put to sleep. And it was hearing Ian Dunbar speak that really changed a lot of the way I work and introduced me to training without aversives. And while I was at this vet practice, I saw in the vet paper an advert, and I was still at school doing school stuff, but I saw this advert for a dog psychology course, and I didn't really understand advertising, so I thought, it's in the vet paper, it must be credible. So I sent them off my money, and they sent me a folder. So I read through the folder, filled in some case studies. They sent me a certificate in dog psychology, and the vet practice I was working at said, you've got your certificate in dog psychology, and most vet practices don't actually know about training behaviour, so they're like, you've got your certificate in dog psychology, why don't you use it to run puppy parties? So I started running puppy parties at the vet practice I was volunteering at, and then started seeing clients, and then it all went from there. And then since then I have actually done more formal training in training and behaviour, and I spent 9 weeks in San Francisco with Gene Donaldson, Ian Dunbar, Donadu for doing an internship there. I did my undergraduate studies in veterinary sciences at the Royal Veterinary College. I did a postgraduate certificate in clinical animal behaviour at the University of Lincoln, and now I tend to spend most of my time either consulting for Kong in the UK, which I'm a behaviour consultant for. I work with guide dogs, so we're working on a project where we're teaching guide dogs to teaching guide dogs in a more humane, in my opinion, more humane way. We're using clicker training, and we're letting them be dogs and allow them to do dog-like stuff rather than punishing them for most behaviours. I also work with zoos and wildlife parks, so we're teaching keepers and trainers how to teach animals for voluntary blood samples, husbandry procedures, moving on to scales, and just cooperative behaviours. Also work with pet owners, and that's something I've done and I really love and enjoy doing, running classes, puppy classes, education evenings, behaviour consultations for pet owners in the home for dogs, cats, parrots, and then I write articles for magazines and do YouTube videos. So that's what I've do in sort of the pet dog world and lecture. So that's me. So shall I get started? Would you like me to start or wait?
Start with your shoes?
I can start with my shoes. Okay, I can start my shoe story now. I was going to tell it this evening, but I can start with the shoe story. So the shoes that I'm wearing are sort of a barefoot contest. A barefoot, what's the word I'm thinking of, begins with a C? Context, no, that's not the word. Concept, that's the word I'm thinking of. So they're sort of a barefoot concept in terms of they've got minimal protection, and you can actually feel quite a lot when you're walking. I know some other people wearing them. And when I first started wearing them, went for a walk, and you could start feeling the difference between sort of the pavement if there's two slabs which are slightly slightly different material, you can actually feel on your feet the slight difference. When you're standing on some ground and there's a slight dip, you can actually feel your toes are slightly up, the back of your foot is slightly up, and there's a dip on the floor. And there's little things that you don't realize when you're maybe wearing more padded shoes. And then I started thinking, actually that relates to dog training or animal training. When we're socializing puppies, for example, and we use lots of treats, potentially that might be like a padded shoe. So we're taking the puppy out into the big wide world, and initially if we're just keeping food on their nose the whole time, or we take them to a new object and just shove food on there, or put food in their nose and try and get them over obstacles, then potentially you're following the food so much, wearing those padded shoes and not necessarily picking up those small details. And that might be a good thing, because for some dogs, and especially shelter animals, they may need that padding. So for cats and dogs, they may need you to help them by manipulating the environment a lot, and the way you handle them. And then there's other times when actually we need to almost use more barefoot shoes and actually let dogs cope and cats cope and develop their own coping systems. So often when we're working with dogs now, especially for aggressive behaviors, trying to change the environment and the context, because they're so used to almost doing one thing, so walking by the owner's side in a certain way, keeping the leash a certain length. And the owners will sometimes say to me, if I keep him right by my side and keep walking, I never see any barking or lunging. If I give him more leash, he starts barking and lunging. And almost that giving him more leash is you're giving him more freedom. He's got it's a little bit different for him. He has to start working things out, and he's more hypersensitive to the environment. Potentially, we need to teach them to cope in those areas. And a lot of people underestimate animals in terms of their coping systems and their ability to change behavior. So often we think because they're pet dogs, and especially rescue animals, just because we add the label rescue in front of them, almost it changes the type of animal they are and their abilities to learn. And what we say is, because he's a rescue dog, we just need to take it a bit more softly with him. Because a rescue cat, we need to treat him differently. And I go to people's homes and they've had the animal for 13 years and they're like, it's a rescue. It's a rescue. Try to bite your arm off because he's a rescue. And so I was like, you've had him for 13 years. I'm sure the last 13 years he hasn't been a rescue. But sometimes we don't allow animals to sort of function on their own. And if they're in the wild, or even if they're not in the wild, if we take many of the animals we live with and they have to start learning to cope by themselves. If given the right environment, they can start figuring things out and start coming up with strategies that help them get out of trouble, that keep them safe, that make them feel less stressed. And sometimes what we do when we're interacting with them is we don't actually allow them to do that, or when they do come up with these coping systems, we actually do things that get in the way of their coping systems. So I'm going to talk about some of that today and show you how that fits in. So I'm going to start with the presentation and go. So I'm going to start with my beliefs and biases. So when I think about animal training, I think about working with animals, that animals don't have a choice to be in the situation they're in. They don't choose to be a guide dog, they don't choose to be a pet dog, they don't choose to be a pet parrot. We choose to go and adopt or rescue or buy an animal. And so often when we buy an animal, they come to us with those limited choices. They don't come to us with a contract and promises. So often most people get a dog and then they're disappointed if the dog doesn't like being touched, or the cat scratches them when they go to pick the cat up. And almost they treat the cat like it's abnormal because the cat doesn't like being picked up. But how many cats pick each other up in the wild? It's not actually a normal behavior for cats to pick each other up. So animals don't come with contracts, but the contracts we almost imagine or make up are usually based on Walt Disney and films and cultural beliefs that may not be true for the animal. So often we have to try and look at expectations and realistic expectations, almost looking at it from the animal's point of view. These animals don't come with these contracts in terms of they're not going to be Lassie, or they're not going to be these animals in the films. One of my big beliefs is we have to start showing animals respect instead of asking for it. And we're big on saying we want the dog to respect us and the animal to respect us. But often, in my opinion, we don't show the animal enough respect. And especially if we're going to put animals in situations that they don't choose to be in, I think we have to start going out of our way, putting in time, energy, maybe money, to make sure we do things that's best by the animal, but that might be more expensive for us. And not expensive just in money, but expensive in terms of time, energy, what we have to do. So sometimes, because we have to rearrange the way the kennel is constructed, because we have to go and put film on the kennel door or the window so the cats can't see out or people can't see in, because that costs time, money, energy. We have to go and look for it, we have to find it. We'll try and take shortcuts, and often we'll try and blame the animal, try and make the animal change rather than us changing the environment to help the animal out. And then I believe we owe animals the respect to use a scientific approach rather than more of a cultural approach or someone's just belief. So rather than just saying, I've always worked with cats and so this is how all cats learn, or this is what someone used to do 30 years ago, so that's what I'm going to carry on doing. I think we have to stay up to date with what we're learning about animals and how they learn, and maybe what's best for them based on scientific research and evidence, because that's often being tested by a wider community, and things may change. So people say, but why does this information now, why is it now different? But the fact it's different is because we've learned something new that's more accurate potentially, and that's not to say, but if we just go by our beliefs, no one is testing beliefs often. So just because we believe something, that's our belief, whereas if it's a scientific fact, then other communities are testing it, other people are testing it. It's not just something you believe in. So it's always questioned. So scientific information is being questioned and changed as it progresses over time. So you're going to pick up on sort of more, it's more likely to improve over time. So for me also, when I think about teaching and training, when we train animals or teach animals, there's primary reasons for doing that, and I think of teaching and training as the same thing. So for me, when we're talking about, we often talk about training animals, teaching people, but when I'm teaching a client, I'm also teaching the animal. From training the animal, I'm training the client. So they both go together for me. There's primary reasons to train and secondary reasons to train, and from yesterday's slides I changed it slightly to just make it a bit more simple and say primary reasons to train are to make life easier for them rather than us. Secondary reasons to train are maybe making life easier for us rather than the animal. And often when we think of training, most people have an artificial concept of training. So when we think of training, we think of obedience, we think of asking the dog to sit, we think of training the dog for agility, we think of training animals for specific tasks, for maybe guide dogs and things like that. But one of the things that I like to try and get people to start thinking about is training principles that we use are actually started off as a description of how animals learn and interact. Now, animals don't just learn and interact when you're ready to interact with them or when you're ready to do a formal training session. So when you get your clicker out and you've got your treat bag out, or you go and put a leash and collar on that dog, that's not the only time you're teaching or training the dog or things are happening. The animal's always behaving. 24 hours a day, the animal's behaving. So you're always, when you interact with the animal, you're changing behavior, you're teaching them. And so even though you're not a professional animal trainer, you're still an animal trainer because you're still changing animal behavior if you know it or not. And if you know how you're doing it or how it works, then when you interact with the animal just in daily life, if you're even cleaning animal cages and there's animal in those cages, you're still potentially training them. And so we're going to talk about some of the principles of how animals learn, so that maybe even if you don't think you're a trainer, you can understand what you're actually doing to influence the animal's behavior. In the primary reasons, I think we should think about things like husbandry training, so things that animals need in terms of their physical and mental well-being, and not just say we're going to take you to the vets, but we're going to teach you how to cope in those situations and make it pleasant for you. Training to reduce stress, so if an animal's going to need to be in a shelter, or if there's things we can do that's going to make it easier for the animal to go into a new home with an adopter, what can we do? And we should be responsible for training those things. So we're going to talk about some of those things during the talk today, especially during the second half.